There are moments when history feels less like the past and more like a memory trying to wake you gently. Tonight is one of those moments. Let the present loosen its grip and allow your thoughts to drift back beyond calendars, beyond nations, beyond the idea that the world has always been the way we know it now. Imagine the slow warmth of an ancient sun drying wet clay. Imagine hands pressing symbols into that surface, not hurried, not decorative, but careful, as if someone understood that these marks would outlast empires, oceans, even memory itself. This is not a story meant to startle you. It is meant to settle into you, quietly, to unfold like a long-forgotten warning whispered across thousands of years, waiting patiently for the moment when someone would finally listen. Long before history was measured in centuries or even dynasties, before maps carried borders or time carried names, the people of southern Mesopotamia believed they were not alone in shaping the world. They did not describe this belief as faith, nor did they frame it as metaphor. To them, it was inheritance, something remembered rather than imagined. Pressed into clay beneath an unforgiving sky, their earliest records speak of beings who arrived before kingship, before cities, before the idea of humanity governing itself. They called them the Anunnaki, those who from heaven to earth came, and they wrote about them with the quiet confidence of witnesses, not worshippers. If you feel drawn to stories like this, the kind that linger and return in cycles rather than endings, you are gently invited to subscribe, not as an obligation, but as a way of walking this long road together whenever you feel the pull to come back. The tablets do not begin with wonder. They begin with order. Names, roles, lineages, territories. The Anunnaki were not presented as distant spirits or abstract forces. They were catalogued. One governed the waters beneath the earth. Another commanded the air and authority. Another shaped living forms with deliberate intent. The scribes wrote these details with the same tone they used for harvest records and boundary stones. Nothing ornamental, nothing symbolic, just continuity. When modern excavators uncovered tens of thousands of these tablets from the ruins of ancient libraries, what unsettled them was not the presence of gods, but the absence of mythic language. There were no poetic evasions, no disclaimers of legend. Instead, there were timelines that stretched beyond comprehension, genealogies that spanned millennia, and references to councils, decisions, and consequences. The Anunnaki argued. They delegated labor. They punished rebellion. They withdrew. And they promised, or perhaps warned, that their absence would not be permanent. The scribes who preserved this knowledge were not mystics. They were professionals, trained for years to copy precisely, to reproduce numbers without alteration, to transmit information without interpretation. Generation after generation, they carried forward details that no longer fit the world they lived in. Reigns that lasted tens of thousands of years. Kings who ruled before the flood. Cities founded before time itself was said to reset. And yet the scribes did not correct these claims. They did not soften them. They preserved them intact, as if accuracy mattered more than understanding. What emerges from these records is not a story of humanity slowly discovering civilization, but of civilization arriving fully formed. Agriculture, writing, law, astronomy, architecture. Not developed gradually, but introduced, taught, enforced. As if humanity had been handed a system and instructed to maintain it in the absence of its original architects. And beneath every instruction, every hymn, every royal inscription, there is a quiet implication that this absence was temporary. The Anunnaki did not vanish in fire or judgment. According to the tablets, they left. They retreated to the heavens or to places beneath the earth. They entrusted governance to human kings whose bloodlines were once closer to theirs, and then slowly less so. Lifespans shortened. Memory faded. Ritual replaced presence. But the records remained, waiting in silence, buried under collapsing walls and drifting sand, holding a single unresolved tension that no civilization since has been able to fully release. What if these were not stories meant to explain the world, but records meant to prepare us for its return? The idea of return lingers beneath the surface of these texts, like a low, steady current. It is never announced dramatically. It is never framed as prophecy in the way later religions would come to understand that word. Instead, it appears as expectation, as scheduling, as if time itself were being measured against an appointment not yet fulfilled. The scribes wrote of cycles, not endings, of ages that rise, decline, and reset. And within those cycles, the presence of the Anunnaki was treated not as eternal, but periodic. In the oldest layers of Sumerian thought, time was not a straight line. It was a great wheel, turning through vast spans that dwarfed human lives. The tablets speak of eras measured in Sar and Ner, units so large they lose meaning when translated into modern years. These numbers were not symbolic flourishes. They were used consistently, mathematically, across astronomical texts, king lists, and ritual calendars. The scribes understood them, they relied on them, and they believed these measures aligned with movements in the heavens. The sky mattered deeply to the Sumerians, not as a realm of fantasy, but as a system of precision. They tracked the paths of planets visible to the naked eye with astonishing accuracy. They mapped the rising and setting of stars. They recorded eclipses. And woven into this astronomical discipline were references to the Anunnaki themselves. Certain gods were associated not just with elements or emotions, but with specific celestial bodies, Anu with the highest heaven, Enlil with the moving air, Enki with the waters beneath the earth, and, strangely, with knowledge that flowed between realms. What troubles modern readers is how seamlessly astronomy and divine history merge in these records. Planetary movements are not described as abstract mechanics. They are described as journeys, returns, withdrawals. When a planet disappears into the sun's glare and reemerges weeks later, the language used mirrors the language of absence and return found in the myths. As above, so below was not a metaphor. It was an operating principle. The tablets hint that the Anunnaki did not experience time as humans do. Their lifespans stretched across ages. Their decisions unfolded over millennia. What felt like myth to later cultures may have been memory compressed into story, a way of translating experiences far outside the human scale into something survivable by human minds. The scribes never claimed the Anunnaki were immortal. They age, they quarrel, they fear consequences, but they move through time with a patience humanity could never afford. One of the most unsettling implications buried in these texts is that humanity was never meant to be permanent stewards of Earth. Kingship was described as a loan, authority as a trust. The Anunnaki installed systems, withdrew oversight, and left instructions behind. Rituals were not acts of devotion alone. They were maintenance procedures. Offerings were not symbolic gestures. They were provisions, prepared in case someone returned to receive them. Over centuries, as generations passed without any visible reappearance, the tone of the texts subtly changed. The certainty softened into reverence. Direct reports became hymns. Administration became theology. Yet the old records were never erased, never revised. Even when belief shifted, memory remained embedded in clay. The past was not corrected to match the present. The present was forced to coexist with an older, more troubling version of reality. And so the question quietly deepens. If the Anunnaki were never meant to stay forever, and never meant to leave forever, then what determines the moment of return? Was it written in the stars, in the slow wobble of Earth's axis, in cycles of catastrophe and renewal, Or was it tied to something humanity would eventually reach again? A level of noise, a level of disorder. A threshold crossed not suddenly, but gradually, until one day the silence left behind by their departure is broken at last. That silence is important. The tablets treat it almost as a condition, something measurable rather than emotional. After the departure of the Anunnaki, the world does not end. Humanity continues. Cities grow. Kings rule. But something is missing, and the scribes knew it. They describe a gradual thinning, not of population, but of connection. Knowledge once given directly now has to be preserved indirectly. Instructions once demonstrated now must be remembered, copied, and taught. Civilization becomes an act of repetition rather than innovation. This is where the role of the scribes becomes almost sacred. They were not merely recording the present, they were maintaining continuity with a time they believed was more ordered, more supervised, more complete. To them, writing was not an art. It was a technology of memory. Clay tablets were durable for a reason. They could survive fire, flood, and abandonment. They could wait, and many of them were clearly written with waiting in mind. Certain tablets are addressed not to contemporary readers, but to future ones. They explain rituals no longer practiced. They list lineages no longer ruling. They preserve measurements that no longer correspond to lived reality. This is not how myths are treated. Myths adapt. They evolve. These did not. They were frozen deliberately, as if alteration would corrupt something essential, as if accuracy mattered more than relevance. The scribes believed humanity was living in an interim age, a managed absence. The Anunnaki had withdrawn their direct presence, but not their oversight. The heavens were still watched. The cycles still turned. And the earth, though left to human hands, was not abandoned. It was being observed from a distance, the way one might monitor an experiment after stepping back. This perspective changes how we read the great catastrophes described in the texts: floods, plagues, collapses. These were not random disasters. They were corrections, adjustments when systems drifted too far from their intended balance. The flood itself was not portrayed as divine rage, but as administrative failure. Humanity had become unmanageable, too numerous, too disruptive. The solution debated was not punishment, but reset. What follows the flood is even more revealing than the flood itself. The Anunnaki do not remain to rebuild. They do not re-establish constant rule. Instead, they redesign humanity. Lifespans are shortened. Fertility is altered. Mortality becomes unavoidable. These changes are described not as curses, but as safeguards, limits placed on a species that had proven too difficult to control when left unchecked. From this point forward, humanity is expected to govern itself within parameters. Kings rule, but their authority is framed as borrowed. Law codes invoke divine mandate, but no longer claim divine presence. Temples grow taller, not because the gods are closer, but because humans are trying to reach them again. Ziggurats rise like artificial mountains, attempts to recreate points of contact that once existed naturally. And yet, beneath all of this adaptation, the old expectation remains. The Anunnaki did not destroy the infrastructure of memory. They did not erase their names. They allowed their stories to persist, unchallenged, preserved by those they left behind. This suggests confidence, the confidence of beings who expect their absence to be temporary, their return inevitable. The silence, then, is not abandonment. It is interval, a long pause between movements in a cycle too large for a single civilization to witness in full. Humanity lives inside that pause, building, forgetting, rediscovering, while the tablets remain buried, patient, holding instructions written for a time when memory alone would no longer be enough. That patience embedded in clay suggests intention. The Anunnaki did not rely on oral tradition, which decays and reshapes itself with each telling. They allowed, and perhaps encouraged, writing, a system that fixes meaning in place, resistant to time. The earliest writing was not poetry or personal expression. It was accounting, inventory, measurement, control. Humanity learned to write not to dream, but to remember exactly. This matters because memory in these texts is treated as a responsibility. Forgetting is dangerous. When instructions fade, systems fail. The collapse of cities is often attributed not to enemy armies or famine alone, but to neglect of proper order, rituals performed incorrectly, calendars misaligned, authority exercised without reference to the original structure that had once governed everything. The Anunnaki are rarely shown punishing humans directly after their withdrawal. Instead, disorder emerges naturally when maintenance lapses. The ziggurats stand as physical expressions of this problem. Built taller with each generation, they were not houses for gods in the human sense. They were interfaces, elevated platforms designed to bridge a gap that had opened between worlds. Their stairways did not invite ascent for the masses. They restricted access. Only trained priests could climb them, carrying offerings prepared according to strict rules. Every brick was placed with measurement and alignment in mind, oriented to stars, winds, and water. From the outside, these structures look like monuments to belief. From the inside, according to the texts, they functioned as points of calibration, places where heaven and earth could still occasionally align. The summit shrines were not public temples. They were quiet spaces, controlled spaces. And the offerings left there were not symbolic: food, drink, textiles, items meant to be used, consumed, replaced regularly, as if absence did not guarantee non-arrival. The Abzu complicates this picture further. Described as a freshwater abyss beneath the earth, it is associated not with death, but with knowledge. Enki's domain was not the sky, but below, beneath cities, beneath foundations. The texts describe his dwelling as extending downward, hidden from view, connected to sources of water that made life possible. In practical terms, this aligns with aquifers, with irrigation, with the unseen systems that sustain civilization. But the language goes beyond metaphor. The Abzu is portrayed as a place of storage, of planning, of creation. Enki retreats there to work, to experiment, to decide. When he emerges, he brings solutions, tools, instructions. The implication is that the most important work of civilization happened out of sight, beneath the surface, long before humans understood what they were being given. Foundation deposits found beneath temples mirror this belief. These were not offerings placed visibly for worshippers. They were buried, sealed, hidden, messages left in the ground itself. Inscribed objects, food, and symbolic items placed beneath walls and floors, as if meant for someone who would approach from below rather than above. Not prayers sent upward, but reports left behind. The wording of these inscriptions is revealing. They do not beg. They inform. They describe what has been built, why it has been built, and ask for continued guidance. The tone resembles correspondence more than devotion, as if the builders believed their work was part of an ongoing project, one temporarily unattended but not abandoned. Over time, as generations passed without response, these practices hardened into religion. What began as maintenance became ritual. What began as instruction became myth. But the underlying structure never disappeared completely. Even when belief shifted, behavior remained. Calendars were still aligned, offerings still prepared, records still copied. Humanity behaved like caretakers long after it forgot what it was caring for. And perhaps that is the most enduring legacy of the Anunnaki in these texts. Not fear, not worship, but responsibility. The sense that the world was not entirely ours, that we inherited it under conditions with expectations attached. Conditions written into clay, buried under cities, waiting through silence for a moment when memory alone would no longer be enough to sustain the system left behind. That sense of responsibility becomes heavier as the texts move forward in time. The farther humanity drifts from the age of direct contact, the more anxious the records become. Not panicked, not apocalyptic, but increasingly preoccupied with precision. Measurements tighten. Ritual instructions grow longer. Astronomical observations become more exact. It is as if the scribes sensed that once memory began to erode, only accuracy could compensate. Astronomy, in particular, shifts from observation to obligation. The movements of the heavens are no longer simply noted. They are watched for signs. Certain alignments are treated with reverence bordering on concern. The rising of specific stars marks not just seasons, but thresholds. The completion of long cycles is recorded carefully, sometimes with annotations suggesting that these moments mattered beyond agriculture or ritual timing. One cycle stands out repeatedly, a slow turning of the sky that takes thousands of years to complete. The scribes did not name it as modern science would, but they understood its effect. The background of the stars shifts gradually over generations. Constellations rise where others once stood. Ages pass not with years, but with the repositioning of the heavens themselves. This was not subtle knowledge, it was central. The implication woven through these records is quiet, but persistent. The return of the Anunnaki was not tied to human calendars. It was tied to cosmic ones. Their movements were synchronized with the sky, not the soil. While humanity counted harvests and rains, the Anunnaki counted ages. What felt like eternity to humans was a pause to them. This explains why the tablets rarely express urgency. There is no call to prepare immediately, no warning of imminent arrival. Instead, there is patience. Confidence that when the correct alignment arrived, the return would happen naturally, without announcement. The signs would be in the heavens first, not on earth. Those who knew how to read the sky would recognize the shift long before anything changed on the ground. Over centuries, this knowledge became fragmented. Priests inherited formulas without context. Astronomers copied tables without fully understanding their origin. The meaning of the cycles remained, but their purpose blurred. What was once a countdown became tradition. What was once observation became ceremony. And yet, some tablets preserve a different tone, a quiet insistence that these calculations were not symbolic, that the heavens were not merely divine decoration, but mechanism. When planets reversed direction in the sky, the texts used language of return. When they vanished and reappeared, the language mirrored withdrawal and emergence. The sky was a map of movement, not of myth. This framing changes how one reads the long silence. The absence of the Anunnaki was not abandonment. It was transit. Movement between points humanity could not follow. Their presence on Earth was one phase in a longer orbit, one chapter in a cycle that extended far beyond any single civilization's lifespan. Humanity, then, was left to wait not passively, but attentively, to watch the sky, to maintain the systems, to preserve the records. Not because return was guaranteed in any given generation, but because forgetting would be the true failure. The danger was not that the Anunnaki might return unannounced. It was that they might return to find no one remembered what the world was meant to be. And so the tablets endure, patient and unchanging, carrying forward a message that grows heavier with time. The sky moves, the cycles turn, and humanity, whether aware of it or not, continues to live inside a pause measured not in years, but in stars. That pause stretches across civilizations, linking cultures that never knew each other by name but shared the same unease. As Mesopotamian cities rose and fell, the expectation did not disappear. It traveled, echoed in altered forms, translated into new symbols, embedded in new mythologies. But its core remained intact. Someone had come before. Someone had taught. Someone had left. And someday, that someone might return. Within Mesopotamia itself, this inheritance became layered. Sumerian names shifted into Akkadian, Akkadian into Babylonian. Gods were renamed, merged, reinterpreted, yet their functions stayed remarkably stable. Enki became Ea, but he remained the Lord of Wisdom and the Deep. Inanna became Ishtar, still governing love and war. Anu remained the distant sky authority, increasingly remote, increasingly abstract. It is as if the personalities persisted even as language evolved around them. This continuity is difficult to explain if these figures were purely symbolic. Symbols adapt easily. They bend to cultural needs. But these did not. Their domains remained fixed. Their relationships remained consistent. Their stories aligned across centuries and political upheavals. The Anunnaki did not behave like myths shaped by human imagination. They behaved like records maintained despite changing administrations. The texts describe their withdrawal as deliberate, not chaotic, not forced. There is no great war that drives them away, no defeat. Instead, there is decision. The Anunnaki debate. They argue. They weigh consequences. And then, gradually, their presence diminishes. Fewer appearances, less intervention, more reliance on human intermediaries. Kings and priests become the interface, speaking on behalf of gods no longer physically present. This transition creates tension within the records. Some texts express frustration. Humanity struggles to maintain order without direct oversight. Noise increases again. Conflict spreads. The land becomes restless. Yet the solution is no longer immediate correction. The Anunnaki do not return to reset the system again. They allow instability to play out within limits, as if testing whether humanity can sustain what it was given. This period is when law codes emerge with unusual authority, not framed as human invention, but as restoration. Hammurabi does not claim to create law. He claims to receive it, to be chosen to reestablish justice according to an older standard. The implication is clear. Law exists independently of rulers. It precedes them, and its origin lies beyond humanity. Even warfare changes character in the texts. Battles are not just contests of power. They are violations or restorations of cosmic order. Victory is framed as alignment with divine mandate, defeat as evidence of deviation. This worldview only makes sense if humanity believes it is being observed, evaluated according to criteria established long before any living king was born. Yet as centuries pass, the tone grows quieter. The expectation of direct return recedes into the background. Not denied, but deferred. People still prepare offerings, still align temples, still record celestial movements. But fewer texts speak openly of the Anunnaki walking among humans. Memory becomes layered beneath ritual, still present, but increasingly distant. What remains constant is the sense of unfinished business. The world feels provisional, as if something essential has been paused rather than concluded. Humanity builds, governs, worships, and wars, but always under the shadow of an earlier order that has not been formally closed. And perhaps that is why these records were never meant to comfort. They were meant to endure, to remind future generations that the silence they lived within was not the natural state of the world, but an interval, a long breath held between movements of a cycle that humanity could sense, but never fully control. That sense of an unfinished cycle quietly shapes how humanity understands itself within these texts. Humans are never described as the final creation. They are described as a solution, a response to a problem. The Anunnaki needed labor. The lesser gods rebelled. Work was too heavy, time too long, conditions too harsh. Humanity was engineered to take on that burden. This origin is stated plainly, without apology or metaphor. Humans were made to work so others would not have to. What unsettles modern readers is not the hierarchy implied, but the transparency of it. The texts do not hide the motive. They do not romanticize creation as an act of love. They describe it as necessity. Clay mixed with divine essence. A new being designed to serve a function. Intelligence enough to follow instruction. Mortality enough to remain controllable. This was not punishment. It was design. Yet within that design, something unexpected emerged. Humans were not passive tools. They multiplied. They organized. They created noise, not just sound, but disruption. Cities grew beyond what was anticipated. Humanity began to alter the environment, to strain systems originally calibrated for smaller numbers. The Anunnaki did not anticipate this fully, or perhaps they did, and underestimated the speed. This tension runs through the flood narratives. Humanity is not destroyed because it is evil. It is destroyed because it has become unmanageable. The flood is not moral judgment. It is resource management. A reset when systems exceed capacity. This framing strips the story of its later theological weight and replaces it with something colder, more administrative. The Anunnaki act like overseers correcting imbalance, not gods punishing sin. After the flood, humanity is redesigned. Limits are imposed, lifespans shortened, mortality made inescapable, reproduction constrained. These changes are described clinically. Adjustments to parameters. Safeguards against another runaway expansion. The goal is not cruelty. It is stability. And yet, within these limits, humans retain something dangerous. Memory. The ability to remember what came before. The ability to record, to preserve, to pass down knowledge beyond any single lifespan. This may have been unintended, or it may have been tolerated. The texts never say the Anunnaki tried to erase memory entirely. They allow stories to persist. They allow names to be remembered. They allow the possibility of recognition. This suggests a complex relationship. Humanity is not merely livestock. It is junior partner, asset, responsibility, something that must be managed, but also understood. The Anunnaki argue over humanity's fate precisely because it matters. Some advocate destruction, others preservation. Enki consistently chooses protection, not out of sentimentality, but because humanity has value beyond labor. Humans can maintain what was built. They can remember. That capacity to remember becomes humanity's defining role after the withdrawal. No longer servants under direct supervision, humans become custodians of a world designed by others. The tablets position humanity as caretakers of systems they did not invent and may not fully understand. Agriculture, law, astronomy, all inherited, all fragile without proper knowledge. The danger, then, is not rebellion. It is ignorance. Forgetting how things work. Forgetting why limits exist. Forgetting that the world operates according to structures older than humanity itself. The texts warn implicitly, not of divine wrath, but of systemic collapse when memory fails. And so humanity moves forward burdened by a strange inheritance. Created to serve, altered to survive, left to govern itself within constraints it did not choose. Watching the sky, copying the tablets, maintaining rituals whose original purpose grows dim. living inside a pause, carrying forward a memory of oversight that no longer feels present, but has never truly ended. That inherited burden reshapes how humanity relates to time itself. In the world described by these tablets, the present is never self-contained. Every moment is anchored to something older, something prior, something that set the conditions long before the first human king took a throne. Time is not owned by the living. It is borrowed. Much like authority, much like land, much like the systems that keep the world stable. This is why the scribes were obsessed with beginnings. Not because they worshipped the past, but because origins defined function. To know what something was for, you had to know who made it and why. Cities were not just settlements, they were installations. Kingship was not just leadership, it was a role within a larger structure. Humanity itself was not an accident of nature, but a response to a crisis that predated it. As the centuries unfolded, this worldview produced a quiet anxiety. The farther humanity moved from the age of direct oversight, the more responsibility it carried without guidance. Decisions once made by the Anunnaki were now made by humans who inherited authority without the full understanding that once accompanied it. The texts reflect this unease subtly. Appeals to divine order grow more frequent. Rituals become more elaborate. The fear is not punishment. It is misalignment. Misalignment with what had been set in motion long ago, with cycles that continue regardless of human awareness, with cosmic rhythms that do not adjust themselves to human ignorance. The Anunnaki are portrayed as patient, but not indulgent. Systems can tolerate error for a time, but not indefinitely. Collapse is not framed as vengeance. It is framed as consequence. This perspective reframes history itself. The rise and fall of cities is not random. It is not purely economic or military. It is structural. Cities flourish when they align with inherited order. They decay when they drift too far from it. Floods, droughts, invasions, these are not punishments, but stress responses within a system under strain. Within this framework, the silence of the Anunnaki becomes more unsettling. Not because it implies abandonment, but because it implies expectation. Humanity is being watched to see whether it can maintain balance without constant correction, whether it can remember enough, preserve enough, to keep the system functioning until the next phase of the cycle begins. The tablets never state what happens if humanity fails completely. They do not describe final destruction. They describe resets, reconfigurations, withdrawals followed by returns. The world does not end. It changes hands. Control shifts. Oversight resumes in new form. And so at the close of this first movement in the story, a quiet question settles into place. Humanity is no longer young. It has filled the world. It has grown loud again, not just in sound, but in impact. The sky is still turning, the cycles still progress, and the memory preserved in clay still waits, not asking whether the Anunnaki were real or symbolic, but asking something more unsettling. Whether humanity, after all this time, has become capable of remembering what it was given and ready to face what might come back to see how it has been used. That question opens the second movement of the story, where memory begins to widen beyond Mesopotamia itself. What the Sumerians recorded did not remain isolated in the soil between the Tigris and Euphrates. As trade routes expanded and peoples migrated, fragments of this inherited understanding traveled with them, reshaped by language and landscape, but never fully erased. The idea of an earlier age of overseers appears again and again, as if different cultures were remembering the same absence from different angles. In Egypt, the earliest texts speak of a time when the gods ruled directly on earth, a distant era called Zep-Tepi, the first time. Kingship was said to descend from the sky, just as in Mesopotamia. Pharaohs did not claim to invent authority. They inherited it. Their role was to maintain ma'at, cosmic balance, not to define it. The similarity is not superficial. It reflects the same underlying belief that order existed before humanity and would endure after it. Across the ancient world, this pattern repeats. Civilizations describe sudden beginnings, knowledge arriving whole. Agriculture, astronomy, architecture appearing without long periods of experimentation. Later generations struggle to improve what already exists, but rarely surpass it. The oldest monuments are often the most precise, the earliest calendars the most accurate. It is as if humanity began not in ignorance, but in the shadow of something already complete. This challenges the modern assumption of linear progress. In these ancient frameworks, history does not move steadily upward. It oscillates. Knowledge is gained, lost, recovered. Ages of brilliance are followed by ages of confusion. The cause is not moral decay, but distance. The farther humanity moves from the source of instruction, the more distorted that instruction becomes. The Anunnaki fit into this pattern as anchors of origin. They represent the point at which order entered the world from outside it. When they depart, humanity is left with echoes, rituals without context, technologies without blueprints, stories that preserve structure but lose function. Over time, the meaning erodes, even as the form remains. This is why myths across cultures often describe gods withdrawing to the sky, to mountains, or to hidden realms beneath the earth. These are not random settings. They mirror the same spatial logic found in Sumerian texts. Above, below, and beyond. Places inaccessible to ordinary humans but still present, still connected. The sky becomes especially important as a place of absence. Not empty but occupied beyond reach. The stars are not distant lights. They are markers, locations, indicators of presence and movement. Ancient astronomies are not purely observational sciences. They are relational. They track where the gods are, not just where the planets appear. This perspective transforms how ancient people understood themselves. Humanity was not the center of creation. It was a participant within a much larger system. The Earth was not isolated. It was integrated, part of a network that included realms humans could not visit, but could observe indirectly through the sky. And so, as the narrative moves outward from Sumer, the question deepens rather than resolves. If multiple civilizations independently preserved the same memory of a prior age of overseers, then the silence left behind becomes harder to dismiss. It begins to feel less like myth and more like inheritance. A shared recollection of a time when the world was not yet entirely human, and history had not yet learned how to forget. That shared recollection suggests a deeper continuity, one that survives not through direct contact, but through structure. When civilizations separated by oceans and millennia describe the same pattern of arrival, instruction, withdrawal, and expectation, it raises the possibility that what endured was not a story, but a framework for understanding reality itself. The names change. The landscapes shift, but the architecture of memory remains intact. In this framework, gods are not supernatural in the later theological sense. They are administrators of order. They establish systems, assign roles, enforce balance, and then step back. Humanity is not created as an end in itself, but as a component within a much larger design. This is why so many ancient cultures describe their gods as lawgivers rather than creators. Creation is assumed. Order is imposed. The Sumerian worldview places humanity in a position that is both privileged and precarious. Privileged because humans are entrusted with stewardship. Precarious because that stewardship exists within constraints humanity did not design. The Anunnaki are not omnipotent, but they are superior in scope. Their decisions unfold over spans of time that dwarf human planning. Their absence does not imply disengagement. It implies scale. This is where the idea of cosmic order becomes inseparable from governance. The heavens are not merely symbolic of authority. They are the reference system by which authority is measured. Kings rule on earth, but legitimacy flows downward from a higher structure. When kings fail, it is not because they offend gods emotionally, but because they disrupt alignment. They act out of phase with the larger system. This belief places enormous weight on observation. Watching the sky is not superstition. It is oversight. The stars become clocks for civilizations that understand themselves as temporary custodians. When alignments repeat, conditions repeat. When conditions repeat, so do consequences. The past is not gone. It is dormant. The Anunnaki within this worldview are not bound to Earth. Their involvement is episodic. They arrive when conditions require intervention and depart when systems stabilize or when humanity must be tested without guidance. Their return is not framed as invasion or salvation. It is framed as resumption, the continuation of a process paused, not concluded. This explains why the texts never ask humanity to summon them. There are no rituals designed to force return, only rituals designed to maintain readiness, alignment, cleanliness, precision. The assumption is that return is governed by conditions, not desire. Humanity cannot call them back prematurely. It can only fail to be ready when the cycle completes. Read this way. The ancient fear was not of divine anger, but of unpreparedness, of being found out of alignment, of having allowed systems to decay beyond repair during the long silence. The tablets function as reminders, not threats. They say, in effect, this is how things were set up. This is how they functioned. Remember this. As humanity moves further into the future described by these texts, the burden of memory grows heavier. Fewer people understand why the rituals exist. Fewer still remember what the alignments once signified. Yet the sky continues to move, indifferent to human forgetting. And somewhere within that movement, the cycle that began with descent may be turning again toward ascent, not yet visible, not yet announced, but approaching slowly, inevitably, according to a timetable written not in years, but in the language of the stars. That slow inevitability alters the meaning of prophecy in these ancient systems. Prophecy is not prediction. It is pattern recognition. The scribes did not claim to see the future through visions or divine whispers. They claimed to understand cycles well enough to anticipate repetition. When something has happened before under certain conditions, it can happen again when those conditions return. This is not mysticism. It is memory applied to time. Within this logic, the most dangerous thing humanity can do is assume uniqueness. To believe that the present moment stands apart from everything that came before. The tablets resist this idea relentlessly. They frame human history as one phase among many, each rising and falling according to the same underlying mechanics. Names change, technologies shift, but the structure persists. This is why catastrophes are never described as surprises. Floods, collapses, and dark ages are treated as known possibilities. They are built into the system. The texts do not ask whether disaster will come, but when and why. And more importantly, whether anything will survive it. Preservation becomes as important as progress. What matters is not how advanced a civilization becomes, but what it manages to carry through the inevitable reset. The Anunnaki, in this context, appear less as rulers and more as custodians of the cycle itself. They intervene not to dominate humanity, but to recalibrate when deviations threaten the integrity of the whole. Their withdrawal after the flood is not indifference. It is trust mixed with risk. Humanity is given room to grow, but also room to fail. This explains the strange duality in how humans are portrayed. On one hand, they are limited, noisy, prone to disorder. On the other, they are entrusted with extraordinary responsibility. They are allowed to remember, allowed to record, allowed to watch the sky and learn its rhythms. No other created beings in these texts are given that role. The sky, then, becomes a teacher in the absence of direct instruction. Its movements are consistent, its cycles reliable. It does not adapt to human error. By studying it, humanity can remain aligned even without guidance. This is why astronomical knowledge survives every collapse. Libraries burn, cities fall, but star lore returns, again and again, rebuilt from fragments. What is never stated outright, but implied repeatedly, is that the return of the Anunnaki would not come with explanation. There would be no announcement clarifying intent, no reassurance, just presence. And that presence would be interpreted according to whatever humanity had become in the meantime, prepared or unprepared, remembering or forgetting. This places an uncomfortable responsibility on every generation, not to await return passively, but to act as if oversight could resume at any point in the cycle, to govern as if alignment still matters, to build as if collapse is not the end, but a phase others will have to navigate after. As the story moves deeper into theory and interpretation, one realization begins to take shape. The ancient warning may not have been about gods at all. It may have been about time, about what happens to any civilization that forgets it is living inside a system far older, far larger, and far less forgiving than human memory tends to believe. That realization draws the narrative toward the most uncomfortable possibility the tablets suggest. Not that the Anunnaki were gods or visitors in a technological sense, but that they represented a level of order humanity periodically loses access to. Whether external or internal, physical or symbolic, their role was to embody structure when chaos threatened to overwhelm it. Their return, then, would not be an arrival from elsewhere, but a reassertion of that structure when conditions demand it. Yet the texts resist being reduced to abstraction. They insist on specificity, names, places, lineages, measurements. This is not how allegories behave. Allegory blurs detail to preserve meaning. These records sharpen detail even when meaning becomes uncomfortable. They preserve contradictions rather than resolving them. The Anunnaki are both cosmic and administrative, both distant and present, both superior and flawed. This tension opens the door to interpretation without closing it. One can read the texts as literal history, describing beings not native to Earth who intervened in human development. One can read them as symbolic memory, encoding the emergence of complex systems in mythic language. Or one can hold both possibilities simultaneously, acknowledging that ancient people may have recorded experiences they could not fully conceptualize using the tools available to them. What matters is not which interpretation is correct, but why the records were preserved so carefully, why thousands of tablets were copied across centuries, why libraries were maintained even when cities fell, why conquerors often spared these texts rather than destroying them. Something about them was considered essential, not inspirational, essential. The scribes understood that knowledge decays faster than stone. They wrote to slow that decay, to stretch memory across spans longer than any dynasty. Their work was not about belief, it was about continuity. If future generations lost context, at least they would inherit structure, names, sequences, cycles. This suggests that the warning embedded in these texts was never meant to be decoded all at once. It was meant to persist, to remain partially unresolved, so that each age would confront it anew according to its own understanding and its own limitations. The Anunnaki do not provide answers. They provide a mirror. As humanity advances technologically, the mirror becomes sharper. Modern readers notice the bureaucratic language, the engineering details, the genetic implications. Ancient descriptions, once dismissed as myth, begin to resemble systems thinking, resource management, population control, environmental thresholds, concepts that feel strangely familiar. This does not mean the ancients predicted modernity. It means they observed something fundamental about complex systems, that they require oversight, that unchecked growth leads to collapse, that resets are not moral failures but structural inevitabilities, and that those who understand the system best are not those who control it, but those who remember how it works. In this light, the Anunnaki may represent the memory of an earlier intelligence that understood the cycle well enough to intervene. Whether that intelligence was external or emergent matters less than the role it played. It arrived when systems failed. It withdrew when stability returned. It left records so that the pattern would not be lost. And perhaps the most unsettling thought is this: if the cycle is real, then return does not depend on belief. It depends on conditions, on noise, on imbalance, on thresholds crossed quietly, gradually, until intervention becomes necessary once again. Those thresholds are never marked by a single moment. The tablets describe them as accumulations, small deviations tolerated at first, then compounding over generations until the system no longer corrects itself. This is why collapse, in these ancient frameworks, always feels sudden to those living through it, yet inevitable in retrospect. The warning signs were always there. They were simply ignored or misunderstood. The Anunnaki narratives frame humanity's greatest risk as misunderstanding scale. Humans experience change in years and lifetimes. The systems governing the world operate in centuries and ages. When imbalance grows slowly, it escapes attention. Noise becomes normal. Strain becomes background. By the time crisis erupts, it feels external, even though it has been building internally all along. This difference in scale may explain why the Anunnaki appear distant and unresponsive for long periods. From a human perspective, centuries of silence feel like abandonment. From the perspective of a system measured in ages, that silence is brief. Intervention is delayed not because it is unlikely, but because it is expensive. A reset reshapes everything. It erases progress along with error. It is used only when no smaller correction remains effective. The tablets suggest that humanity once lived closer to those thresholds. Early cities were fragile, populations small, environmental feedback immediate. A flood or drought would erase generations. Over time, as systems grew more complex, humanity gained the ability to buffer itself from consequence. Irrigation delayed famine, storage softened scarcity, law contained conflict. These achievements were celebrated, but they also created distance between action and outcome. This buffering is both humanity's strength and its danger. The farther consequence is delayed, the easier it becomes to cross limits unknowingly. The texts hint that this is precisely what triggered earlier interventions. Not cruelty, not punishment, but a lag between cause and effect that grew too wide to correct gently. In this context, the Anunnaki function as external regulators. They intervene when internal regulation fails. Their withdrawal after the flood can be read as confidence that new limits would slow humanity enough to remain within bounds for a longer span. Shorter lifespans, slower accumulation, less noise, a longer pause before the next threshold. Yet the tablets never claim this solution is permanent. They imply that humanity will grow again, that limits will be tested again, that memory will fade again, The cycle does not end. It stretches. What becomes clear in these records is that the true warning was never about gods returning in fire or glory. It was about systems reaching saturation, about civilizations mistaking stability for permanence, about forgetting that order is borrowed, not owned. And as humanity moves further from the age when these warnings were first written, the question is no longer whether the Anunnaki were real in a literal sense. The question becomes whether the conditions they described are real now, whether the thresholds they feared are approaching quietly, unnoticed, masked by complexity, while the sky continues its patient turning, indifferent to human certainty. That quiet approach is exactly how the ancient texts describe the moments before correction. There are no trumpets, no declarations. Life continues as normal while pressure accumulates beneath the surface. Kings still rule, crops still grow, temples still stand. And yet beneath the appearance of stability, something fundamental begins to drift out of alignment. The scribes understood this drift intuitively. They did not measure it only in harvest yields or political unrest, but in subtler signs, changes in the sky, irregular seasons, omens that felt less like messages and more like symptoms. In these records, omens are not supernatural warnings sent deliberately. They are indicators, signals that a system is under strain. A lunar eclipse does not cause disaster. It reveals vulnerability. A failed ritual does not anger the gods. It exposes loss of precision. The anxiety that grows in later texts is not fear of divine punishment, but fear of misreading the signs, of failing to recognize when a threshold is being approached. This is where the role of divination becomes clearer. It was not fortune-telling. It was diagnostics. The liver of a sacrificed animal, the pattern of smoke, the movement of clouds. These were treated as readouts of a system's health. Primitive by modern standards, but guided by the same instinct that drives complex monitoring today. When direct oversight is absent, observation becomes survival. The Anunnaki are rarely invoked directly in these practices. Their names appear as reference points, not as respondents. The assumption is not that they will answer questions, but that their order still governs outcomes. Humanity is trying to stay aligned with rules that exist regardless of awareness. This reinforces a disturbing implication. Intervention does not happen because humans ask for it. It happens because conditions require it. The flood did not occur because humanity prayed incorrectly. It occurred because noise reached a level the system could no longer absorb. Enki's warning to the survivor was not mercy granted by prayer. It was contingency planning. As centuries pass, fewer people remember this logic. Omens become moralized. Disasters become punishments. The system is reframed as emotional rather than structural. This shift comforts humanity because emotions can be appeased. Structures cannot. They respond only to balance. The tablets, however, never fully adopt the emotional framing. Beneath hymns and prayers, the older logic remains visible. The Anunnaki do not rage. They calculate. They debate outcomes. They choose interventions based on scale, not sentiment. This is perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the entire tradition. The universe described is not cruel, but it is indifferent to human narratives. And so, as memory fades and myth thickens, humanity continues to operate within a system it increasingly misunderstands. Ritual replaces comprehension. Hope replaces alignment. Yet the cycles continue unaffected. The sky still turns. The thresholds still exist. And the pause humanity inhabits stretches on, not because it is endless, but because the moment of correction has not yet arrived. That prolonged pause creates an illusion of safety. When generations pass without visible correction, humanity begins to assume that the system has either changed or no longer applies. The ancient texts describe this moment with subtle concern. It is not rebellion that alarms the scribes. It is confidence. The belief that the world can be managed indefinitely without reference to its original constraints. This is when memory becomes most fragile, not because it is lost, but because it is reinterpreted. Stories that once described oversight are retold as allegory. Records that once served as instruction are reframed as metaphor. The Anunnaki become distant gods, then symbolic forces, then literary artifacts. The function of the texts shifts, even as the words remain the same. Yet the scribes never fully abandon the old framework. Even in later periods when belief has softened, the structure of record-keeping persists. Astronomical diaries continue, omen lists expand, kings still justify authority through alignment with an older order. Something in the collective memory resists erasure, even when comprehension fades. This resistance suggests that the system left behind was resilient by design. It did not depend on belief to function. The cycles operate whether they are understood or not. The thresholds exist whether they are acknowledged or dismissed. Humanity can ignore them for a time, but cannot remove them. The Anunnaki narratives imply that the greatest danger is not ignorance, but forgetting that ignorance exists. When humanity knows it does not understand, it remains cautious. When it believes it has outgrown the need for oversight, it accelerates toward limits it can no longer see. The tablets describe previous ages that reached this point, cities that believed themselves eternal, kings who assumed authority without reference to alignment, populations that expanded beyond the capacity of land and water to sustain them. In each case, collapse followed not as punishment, but as consequence. The system corrected itself when internal regulation failed. What is striking is how little emphasis the texts place on morality. They do not condemn ambition. They do not shame growth. They simply note outcomes. When balance is lost, correction occurs. When balance is maintained, stability persists. The universe they describe does not judge. It responds. This worldview offers no comfort, but it offers clarity. Humanity is not singled out for special treatment. It is subject to the same mechanics as everything else within the system. The Anunnaki, whether external beings or embodiments of that system, operate according to the same logic. They intervene when necessary. They withdraw when possible. As the narrative continues forward in time, this clarity becomes obscured, but never fully extinguished. Beneath myth, beneath theology, beneath philosophy, the ancient framework waits, quiet, unchanged, holding the possibility that the pause humanity inhabits is not an ending, but a holding pattern, sustained only as long as balance allows. That holding pattern is difficult to perceive from within. When stability extends across lifetimes, it begins to feel permanent, even natural. The tablets warn against this illusion indirectly by preserving memories of worlds that once felt just as stable, just as complete, just as certain of their continuity. Those worlds ended not with warning, but with surprise, not because the signs were absent, but because they were misunderstood. In the Sumerian worldview, collapse is rarely dramatic at first. It begins with subtle inefficiencies. Water no longer flows where it once did. Fields yield less. Records grow inconsistent. Authority fragments. None of these signs are catastrophic alone. Together, they indicate drift, a system slowly losing coherence as its parts fall out of synchronization. The Anunnaki are invoked in these moments not as saviors, but as reference points. The texts ask whether current practices still resemble the original instructions, whether measurements still align, whether rituals still correspond to celestial timing. The assumption is not that the Anunnaki will intervene immediately, but that deviation can be corrected internally if recognized early enough. This belief places enormous responsibility on awareness. Knowledge becomes a form of infrastructure. When it degrades, collapse accelerates. The scribes understood that ignorance compounds faster than error. A mistake can be corrected. A forgotten principle cannot. This is why certain texts read almost like manuals rather than myths. They explain procedures in detail. They preserve lists, sequences, formulas. They repeat information redundantly across tablets, ensuring survival through partial loss. This redundancy is not inefficiency. It is insurance. The scribes expected disruption. They prepared for it. What they could not guarantee was interpretation. Future generations might inherit the data without understanding its purpose. They might preserve form while losing function. This is the quiet tragedy the tablets seem to anticipate, not destruction of knowledge, but misapplication. As humanity moves deeper into complexity, this risk increases. Systems become layered. Feedback loops lengthen. Consequences are delayed. The ability to perceive thresholds diminishes. In such conditions, intervention, if it occurs, will feel sudden, even arbitrary, despite being the result of long accumulation. The Anunnaki narratives suggest that return would not be preceded by explanation. There would be no gradual reintroduction. The system would shift, and humanity would be forced to respond with whatever understanding it had preserved. The quality of that response would determine survival, not belief. This reframes the ancient fear entirely. It was never fear of gods. It was fear of facing correction without comprehension, of standing before a resumed order with only fragments of memory to guide action. And so the pause continues, quiet, deceptively calm, sustained not by assurance, but by balance that has not yet tipped beyond recovery. Whether that balance can endure indefinitely is the question the tablets leave unanswered, suspended in clay, waiting for a future that would have to answer it through experience rather than interpretation. That unanswered question is the point where interpretation begins to turn inward. The later texts grow less concerned with recounting past interventions and more focused on diagnosing the present. Humanity, by this stage, is no longer measuring itself against the Anunnaki directly, but against the condition of the world it inhabits. The gods recede further into abstraction, yet the system they once enforced remains painfully tangible. This is where cycles become central again. Not just cosmic cycles, but social and ecological ones. Cities expand, resources strain, authority concentrates, then fragments. The pattern repeats with such consistency that it begins to feel mechanical. The tablets no longer need to name the Anunnaki to imply oversight. The cycle itself becomes the evidence. In these later periods, the language shifts subtly. Instead of asking when the gods will return, texts ask when balance will be restored. The focus is no longer on presence, but on correction. This suggests an evolving understanding. Perhaps the Anunnaki were never meant to be awaited as figures, but recognized through the effects of their function. When order returns, so do they, whether or not they are seen. This interpretation blurs the line between external and internal causation. If intervention manifests as systemic reset, then the distinction between divine action and natural process becomes irrelevant. What matters is outcome. Floods still come. Empires still fall. Knowledge is still lost and regained. The system behaves as it always has, regardless of how humanity explains it. The tablets preserve moments when humans sensed they were approaching a limit. Warnings appear not as proclamations, but as unease. Priests note irregularities. Astronomers remark on unusual alignments. Kings commission restorations and reforms, attempting to realign governance with ancient standards. These efforts are earnest, but often insufficient. Realignment requires more than ritual. It requires understanding. The Anunnaki, in this light, may represent a memory of understanding itself, a time when the system was not opaque, when its rules were known because they had been explained. After withdrawal, humanity is left to infer those rules through observation and consequence. Learning becomes slower. Error becomes costly. This is why the texts emphasize humility without using the word. Humans are reminded again and again that they did not design the system they inhabit. They can work within it, but cannot rewrite it. Attempts to do so lead not to rebellion, but to collapse. The warning is implicit, not moralistic. As this realization settles, the narrative approaches a threshold of its own. The story of the Anunnaki no longer functions solely as ancient history. It becomes a lens through which any civilization might examine itself. The question shifts quietly from who they were to what happens when the balance they once enforced is tested again, not by ignorance, but by confidence that no such balance is needed anymore. That confidence marks a subtle turning point in the cycle. It is not loud. It does not announce itself as defiance. It appears instead as certainty. The belief that humanity has finally outgrown the need for inherited frameworks, that knowledge is now self-generated, that progress is irreversible. The tablets never describe this moment directly, but they circle it carefully, as if aware that naming it too clearly might invite repetition. In earlier ages, humility was enforced by proximity. The presence of the Anunnaki, whether literal or conceptual, imposed limits simply by existing. After their withdrawal, limits had to be remembered. When memory weakened, confidence rushed in to fill the space. The world felt increasingly human-owned. Systems felt mastered rather than borrowed. Authority felt earned rather than entrusted. This is where the ancient warnings grow most relevant, not because they predict a specific event, but because they describe a state of mind. A civilization that no longer believes it is inside a cycle is one that has already stepped outside alignment. Not intentionally, but inevitably. When growth is no longer balanced by restraint, correction becomes the only remaining mechanism. The texts imply that previous resets did not occur at moments of desperation, but at moments of peak confidence. When cities were strongest, when technologies were most advanced, when leadership felt secure enough to ignore older constraints. Collapse followed not failure, but success extended too far without recalibration. In this sense, the Anunnaki do not return to punish weakness. They return to interrupt excess. Or, if interpreted symbolically, the system itself intervenes when excess becomes unsustainable. The form of that intervention is shaped by conditions: flood, drought, fragmentation, migration. The cause is less important than the function: reduction, simplification, reset. What survives these resets is never power. It is memory, small groups, fragmented texts, oral traditions, practices stripped of their original context but still carrying structural truth. These remnants seed the next cycle. Civilization rebuilds not from nothing, but from echoes. The scribes seem to understand this. They wrote not for continuity of empire, but for continuity of knowledge. Their loyalty was not to kings, but to structure, to cycles, to the idea that even if everything else failed, something essential might endure long enough to be useful again. This casts the ancient libraries in a new light. They were not archives of the past. They were lifeboats for the future. Collections designed to survive collapse and speak to those who would emerge afterward. Confused, searching for orientation in a world that no longer made sense. And perhaps this is why the Anunnaki narratives were preserved so stubbornly. Not because they were comforting, but because they explained collapse without despair. They framed it as part of a process rather than an end. They suggested that what feels like catastrophe from within a cycle may be recalibration from beyond it. As the story continues forward, the question becomes quieter but heavier. If cycles do not end, only pause and resume, then humanity's task is not to escape them, but to recognize where it stands within one, and to ask, without panic but with honesty, whether the confidence of the present moment feels more like stability or more like the calm that precedes correction. That calm has a particular texture in the ancient texts. It is described not as peace, but as saturation, a fullness that leaves little room for adjustment. Cities sprawl, systems interlock, dependencies multiply. When something breaks, it no longer fails locally. It cascades. The scribes did not have modern language for complexity, but they recognized its effects. They saw how tightly bound systems amplify both success and collapse. In earlier ages, failure was isolating. A village starved, a city fell, others endured. In later ages, described with increasing unease, failure spreads. Trade networks transmit shortage. Alliances transmit conflict. Environmental strain compounds across regions. The system becomes efficient, but brittle. This brittleness is never framed as moral weakness. It is framed as structural inevitability. The Anunnaki narratives fit naturally into this understanding. They are invoked not at the edges of society, but at its center. When complexity peaks, oversight becomes necessary again. Not because humans have failed ethically, but because the system has grown beyond the capacity of local correction. At that point, intervention must come from outside the system itself, or the system must collapse inward. This is why the tablets never describe gradual reform as sufficient once certain thresholds are crossed. Small corrections work only while systems remain flexible. Once rigidity sets in, change becomes disruptive by default. The flood, in this sense, is not unique. It is an extreme example of a broader principle. When flexibility is lost, only large-scale disruption can restore balance. The scribes did not present this as destiny. They presented it as risk. Awareness could delay collapse. Alignment could soften correction. Memory could preserve what mattered most. But no solution offered permanence. Permanence itself was the illusion they warned against. As humanity moves deeper into its own complexity, the ancient framework becomes uncomfortably familiar. The same signs appear: expansion followed by saturation, innovation followed by dependency, confidence followed by fragility. The names change, the materials change, the cycle does not. The Anunnaki, whether understood as beings, symbols, or memory of a higher-order regulation, occupy the same role in every interpretation. They represent the boundary between internal management and external correction. They are what appears when systems can no longer correct themselves gently. The tablets never say whether the Anunnaki desire return. Desire is irrelevant. The cycle turns regardless of intent. What matters is readiness. Not readiness to resist, but readiness to understand. To recognize correction not as annihilation, but as transition. And so the story moves closer to its most difficult territory. Not speculation about ancient visitors, but reflection on inherited patterns. The realization that humanity may not be unique in facing these limits, that others before may have reached them, failed to recognize them, and left behind warnings in forms that would survive long enough to be rediscovered only when the same conditions began to form again. That rediscovery is rarely dramatic. It happens quietly, almost accidentally, when fragments from the past begin to resonate with the present. A line on a tablet suddenly feels less symbolic. A cycle once dismissed as myth aligns too neatly with observable patterns. The ancient language does not predict specific events, but it describes conditions with unsettling accuracy. And recognition arrives not as fear, but as unease. This is where the second movement of the story completes its arc. The Anunnaki are no longer confined to the distant past. They become a conceptual presence in the present moment, not as figures descending from the sky, but as a reminder that humanity has faced this kind of threshold before, that saturation, confidence, and fragility are not modern inventions, but recurring states within long cycles of development. The tablets never instruct humanity on how to avoid correction entirely. They offer no formula for permanence. Instead, they emphasize awareness. Knowing that cycles exist changes how one inhabits them. It encourages restraint where excess is tempting, preservation where consumption feels easier, memory where forgetting offers comfort. In the ancient worldview, the greatest achievement was not dominance over nature, but harmony with limits. Cities that endured longest were not the largest, but the most balanced. Kings remembered not for conquest, but for restoration. The Anunnaki themselves are praised not for power, but for establishing order that could survive their absence. This reframes the idea of return one final time within this act. Return does not have to mean arrival. It can mean reassertion, the reappearance of limits, the re-emergence of consequences long delayed. In that sense, the Anunnaki never truly left. Their function continued, embedded in the structure of the world, waiting for conditions to make it visible again. As the narrative prepares to move into catastrophe and reset, the tone remains calm. There is no warning of imminent disaster, only the steady acknowledgement that cycles do not pause indefinitely. They resume when conditions align, and alignment is never announced. It is recognized only in hindsight. What the ancients left behind was not fear, but orientation, a way to understand collapse without surrendering to despair, a reminder that what feels like an ending from within a cycle may be a beginning from beyond it, and that the true inheritance of humanity is not dominion, but participation in a process far older, far larger, and far more patient than any civilization that briefly rises within it. That patience becomes almost unbearable as the cycle finally tips. The ancient texts describe this transition not as a sudden rupture, but as a deepening imbalance that can no longer be absorbed. What was once flexible becomes rigid. What was once resilient becomes brittle. The system reaches a state where even minor disturbances trigger disproportionate effects. And in that moment, correction is no longer optional. It is inevitable. The catastrophe that follows is not framed as a singular event, but as convergence. Multiple stresses arriving at once. Environmental shifts coincide with social fracture. Political authority weakens as resources strain. Trust erodes. The world feels louder, faster, less predictable. Yet from within the moment, these changes still feel manageable. Humanity has always adapted. It believes it will adapt again. The flood narratives capture this false confidence with chilling restraint. There is no panic in the language, no screaming crowds, no desperate prayers. Instead, there is decision. The Anunnaki convene. They assess the situation. They acknowledge that previous adjustments have failed. And they choose a reset not out of anger but necessity. The calmness of this choice is what makes it unsettling. The flood is not portrayed as destruction of the world, but as reconfiguration. Water becomes the instrument because water erases without discriminating. It removes excess while preserving potential. Life is not eliminated. It is thinned, simplified. Return to a state where growth can begin again without immediately overwhelming the system. This framing strips the event of moral drama. Humanity is not judged unworthy. It is deemed unsustainable under current conditions. The reset is not punishment. It is recalibration. The texts emphasize this by focusing not on suffering, but on survival, on what is carried through the waters: seeds, animals, knowledge, memory. The role of the survivor is critical, chosen not for virtue, but for compliance. The instructions given are precise: measurements, materials, timelines. This is not faith-based salvation. It is engineering. The Anunnaki ensure that something endures, not because humanity deserves it, but because continuity matters. What is destroyed is scale. What survives is structure. After the waters recede, the world is smaller, quieter, more manageable. Humanity emerges diminished but intact, and with it, the memory of what happened, preserved not as trauma, but as warning. This is the moment when the cycle reveals its harshest truth. Correction does not negotiate. It does not compromise. It resets conditions to restore balance, regardless of cost. The kindness, if it can be called that, lies only in preservation of potential. As the narrative moves deeper into catastrophe and reset, the ancient calm remains. The texts do not mourn the lost world. They assume it had already passed its limit. What matters now is what follows: how humanity carries memory forward into a quieter age, and whether it will recognize the signs sooner the next time the cycle begins to turn again. That quieter age begins not with celebration, but with disorientation. The world that emerges after reset is familiar in shape but altered in scale. Rivers still flow, seasons still turn, but the density of life has changed. Silence replaces saturation. Space opens where once there was pressure. Humanity steps into this new phase cautiously, carrying fragments of a world it no longer fully remembers. The tablets describe this moment with remarkable restraint. There is no triumph in survival. Survival is simply a fact. The focus shifts immediately to re-establishment. Where to settle, how to divide land, which practices to restore and which to abandon. The Anunnaki are still present, but at a distance. Oversight resumes briefly, not to rule, but to set boundaries for the next cycle. It is here that the limits imposed after the flood take their clearest form. Lifespans are reduced decisively. Authority is fragmented. Kingship returns, but with shorter reigns. The possibility of long-lived hybrid rulers fades. Humanity is made more local, more temporal, less capable of rapid accumulation. These changes are not explained. They are implemented. The tone of the texts suggests this was intentional. A slower humanity is a safer humanity. Growth stretched across generations rather than concentrated in centuries allows memory to function more effectively. Mistakes are contained. Excess dissipates before it can saturate the system again. Yet even in this reduced state, the seeds of complexity remain. Agriculture spreads, trade resumes, cities form. Humanity does not abandon its nature. It rebuilds, cautiously at first, then with increasing confidence. The cycle does not reset to zero, it resets to an earlier point on the curve. The Anunnaki, having re-established parameters, withdraw again. Their presence fades quickly from the records. There is no long era of direct rule. Humanity is left once more to govern itself within new constraints. The pause resumes, but with altered conditions. This second withdrawal carries a different weight. Humanity now has memory of collapse. Stories circulate. Flood myths spread across cultures. The details vary, but the core remains. Water, survival, instruction, reset. These stories serve as brakes on confidence, at least for a time. But memory fades. Each generation experiences the world as given, not as restored. Over centuries, the flood becomes legend, then symbol, then moral tale. The structural warning embedded within it dulls. Humanity begins again to test limits, unaware that it is repeating a pattern rather than forging a new path. The tablets seem almost resigned to this outcome. They do not expect humanity to escape the cycle. They expect it to move through it repeatedly, carrying forward just enough memory each time to ensure continuity, but never enough to prevent repetition entirely. And so, as the post-flood world stabilizes and grows, the ancient question returns in a new form. Not whether catastrophe will come again, but how much will be remembered when it does. Whether the next reset will find humanity better prepared, or once again surprised by a correction written into the structure of the world itself. That repetition is not treated as failure in the ancient texts. It is treated as rhythm. The scribes did not believe humanity was meant to perfect itself and escape the cycle. They believed humanity was meant to move within it, learning incrementally, preserving fragments, and slowly expanding the range of what could survive each reset. Progress was not measured by permanence, but by resilience. In the generations after the flood, this philosophy quietly shapes behavior. Cities are rebuilt closer to rivers, but with memory of their danger. Laws emphasize restraint. Myths emphasize humility. The presence of the Anunnaki lingers not as fear, but as reference. Their names are invoked less often, yet their order is still assumed to exist beyond human decision. What changes most noticeably is humanity's relationship to catastrophe. Disaster is no longer unthinkable. It is expected. Planning includes it implicitly. Grain is stored. Knowledge is copied redundantly. Lineages are recorded with care. The assumption is not that the world will last forever, but that something must endure beyond its inevitable transformation. The tablets suggest that this period produces humanity's most enduring contributions. Writing systems stabilize. Mathematics advances. Calendars are refined. These are not luxuries. They are survival tools, ways of anchoring memory against erosion. Civilization becomes less about expansion and more about coherence. Yet coherence has limits. Over centuries, success accumulates. Populations grow. Trade networks widen. The old caution softens. Humanity begins once again to mistake stability for immunity. The flood recedes into mythic distance. The practical lessons embedded within it are retained only partially, often stripped of their original context. The Anunnaki, now absent for generations, begin to feel less like overseers and more like ancestors. Their administrative role is forgotten. Their presence is romanticized or moralized. The structural logic they embodied is replaced with narrative comfort. The system remains, but understanding of it fades. This is the moment the tablets seem most concerned with. Not the flood itself, but what follows success after survival. The danger is not rebuilding. It is forgetting why limits were imposed. Lifespans shorten, but ambition does not. Authority fragments, but power still concentrates. The same pressures begin to form under new conditions. The cycle, patient and impersonal, continues to turn. The reset has bought time, not resolution. Humanity has been slowed, not changed. And as the memory of catastrophe dulls, the long pause resumes its quiet work, allowing complexity to grow again toward thresholds that will feel distant, abstract, and safely hypothetical, right up until the moment they are not. That sense of safety is always the most deceptive phase of the cycle. The ancient texts describe it without judgment, almost with sympathy. Humanity cannot live forever in the shadow of catastrophe. Memory fades because life demands forward motion. Children are born into stability, not survival. For them, the world has always worked. Rivers flood and recede. Cities stand. The sky moves predictably. Nothing feels fragile. It is in this environment that the old structures quietly transform. Laws become tools of power rather than balance. Rituals become performances rather than calibrations. Knowledge becomes specialized, fragmented across professions, no longer held together by a shared understanding of its purpose. The system still functions, but coherence weakens. The tablets hint that this is when the most dangerous misunderstanding takes root. Humanity begins to believe that order emerges naturally from human effort alone, that cities exist because humans are clever, that law exists because humans are just, that civilization is self-sustaining. The idea that these systems were inherited, installed, or guided fades into abstraction. At this stage, the Anunnaki are no longer remembered as administrators of order, but as distant gods who demand loyalty or devotion. Their original role as system setters is lost. Worship replaces alignment. Prayer replaces understanding. This shift is subtle but profound. When order is seen as emotional rather than structural, correction is misunderstood as punishment instead of consequence. The texts become more symbolic during this period, not because reality has changed, but because comprehension has. Stories grow richer, more dramatic. Gods argue more loudly. Moral lessons take precedence over structural warnings. The memory is still there, but it has been transformed into something easier to live with. Yet beneath this transformation, the signs continue. Cities grow denser. Resources stretch thinner. Authority consolidates. Feedback loops lengthen. The same conditions that preceded earlier corrections quietly reassemble themselves, adapted to new technologies and new scales. The ancient scribes did not view this as tragedy. They viewed it as inevitability. Humanity, they believed, could not remain permanently aware of the system it lived within. Awareness itself decays under comfort. The best that could be hoped for was that fragments of understanding would survive long enough to matter again. And so, the cycle advances. Not with menace, but with patience. The world does not rush toward collapse. It allows humanity to fill every available space, to test every limit, to believe fully in its own permanence. Only when flexibility is exhausted does the system respond. The tablets end this phase with no warning, only implication. A reminder, pressed quietly into clay, that the most dangerous moment in any civilization is not when it fears collapse, but when it can no longer imagine it. That inability to imagine collapse is the final threshold before correction. The ancient texts never dramatize this moment. They do not describe panic or prophecy. Instead, they describe normalcy stretched too far. The world appears stable on the surface, but beneath it, tension has become structural. Systems no longer bend. They resist, then break. At this stage, the signs grow clearer, but harder to interpret. Floods become more destructive. Droughts last longer. Social unrest spreads unevenly, flaring in one region while another prospers. Leaders respond with force or reform, but neither reaches the root. The problem is no longer local. It is systemic. The Anunnaki, when mentioned at all, appear only as distant reference points. Their absence is complete. No warnings arrive. No guidance intervenes. Humanity is fully on its own, operating within constraints it barely remembers. This silence is not abandonment. It is confirmation that the system has entered a phase where internal correction is no longer sufficient. The tablets imply that once this point is reached, reversal is unlikely. Not impossible, but improbable. Complexity has grown too dense, dependencies too interwoven. Any attempt to simplify threatens collapse anyway. The system has become locked into its own momentum. What follows is not a single disaster, but a cascade. Failures trigger failures. Trust erodes. Infrastructure strains. Knowledge fragments. None of this feels sudden to those living through it. Each event has an explanation. Each failure feels manageable in isolation. It is only in hindsight that the pattern becomes visible. The ancient writers understood this painfully well. They had lived through such cascades. They had watched cities empty, trade routes vanish, languages die. Their calm tone is not indifference. It is recognition. Panic does not alter outcome. Only memory endures. This is where catastrophe shifts from warning to process. The flood is only one expression: fire, famine, migration, war. These are tools of reduction. They simplify the system by force when gentler mechanisms fail. What survives is not what is strongest, but what is adaptable. The tablets do not condemn this phase. They describe it. They assume it. The world, they suggest, has done this before and will do it again. Humanity's task is not to stop the cycle, but to pass through it with as much continuity as possible. And so, as the pressure finally releases, the ancient narrative remains steady. The cycle turns. The pause ends. Correction begins, not as judgment from above, but as the natural consequence of imbalance long ignored, unfolding exactly as it always has. As correction unfolds, the ancient texts slow their pace even further, as if urging the listener not to resist the moment but to observe it carefully. This phase is not chaos in the raw sense. It is unwinding, the release of tension stored over centuries. Structures loosen, boundaries blur, populations move not out of ambition but necessity. Migration replaces conquest as the dominant motion of humanity. The scribes describe this period as a thinning of the world. Cities that once pulsed with life grow quiet. Some are abandoned entirely, left to wind and sand. Others shrink into shadows of themselves, their monumental centers repurposed or forgotten. The loss is not only physical. Knowledge contracts, skills narrow. What once required specialization now demands survival. Yet within this contraction, something subtle persists. Memory does not vanish uniformly. It concentrates. Small groups carry fragments of the old world with them. A method of counting. A story of the flood. A calendar pattern. A name remembered without full context. These fragments are not chosen deliberately. They survive by chance, by usefulness, by resonance. The tablets suggest that this is how continuity truly works, not through preservation of everything, but through selective endurance. What remains is what can still function in reduced conditions. Excess falls away. Complexity sheds layers until only the essential remains. During this phase, the Anunnaki are absent even in memory. Their names fade from daily life. What survives of them is structure without attribution. Practices continue without explanation. Rituals persist because they work, not because they are understood. Alignment becomes instinctual rather than conscious. This is also the period when time itself feels different. Without dense record-keeping, years blur together. Generations overlap indistinctly. History shortens. The world feels older and smaller at the same time. Humanity lives closer to immediate consequence, less buffered, more responsive. The ancient writers did not romanticize this stage. They did not call it purification or renewal. They treated it as passage, necessary, difficult, temporary. The system, having shed excess, begins to stabilize again. New balances form, new limits assert themselves, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the pressure that drove collapse dissipates. The sky still turns. Seasons reassert rhythm. Settlements root themselves again. The cycle does not announce its next phase. It simply moves forward, carrying with it a humanity reduced in scale, but not erased. A humanity once again capable of listening, even if it no longer remembers exactly what it is listening for. That renewed capacity to listen marks the quiet turning point between collapse and renewal. The ancient texts describe it indirectly, through changes in behavior rather than declarations. Humanity becomes attentive again, not to ambition, but to signals. Weather patterns are watched closely. Animal behavior is noted. The sky regains importance not as abstraction, but as guide. Survival sharpens perception. In this reduced world, complexity rebuilds slowly. Innovation returns, but cautiously. Tools improve incrementally. Social bonds tighten. Authority emerges locally rather than universally. There is no rush to recreate what was lost. Memory of excess still lingers in absence, shaping restraint without needing explanation. This is when stories begin to change tone. Instead of celebrating greatness, they emphasize origin. Instead of glorifying conquest, they recount survival. Myths of floods, fires, and darkness circulate widely, carried by travelers and reshaped by landscape, but always anchored to the same core experience. The world was once full, then it was emptied. Now it is returning. The scribes understood that this stage was the most fertile for transmission. Knowledge passed here has a higher chance of survival because it is tied to necessity. Calendars matter because planting depends on them. Measurements matter because resources are scarce. Law matters because cohesion is fragile. Nothing is ornamental yet. It is also during this phase that echoes of the Anunnaki reappear, stripped of detail but heavy with meaning. Beings who taught. Watchers who set things right. Ancestors who came from the sky or the deep. Their names differ, but their role is familiar. They are remembered not as rulers, but as bringers of order after chaos. This suggests that memory does not vanish with collapse. It transforms. Complex narratives compress into symbols. Administrative figures become gods. Procedures become rituals. The structure survives even as language simplifies. What matters is not accuracy, but continuity of function. As stability slowly increases, settlements grow. Trade resumes. Languages diversify. Writing, if it returns, does so humbly, often first as tally marks and records of exchange. The long climb begins again, guided by fragments of an order that predates memory. The cycle, having released pressure, now allows growth once more. But the ancient texts never imply that this growth is permanent. It is provisional, a new ascent along a familiar curve. And embedded within the stories of survival is an unspoken understanding. The pause will come again. The test will return. The question will repeat, waiting patiently for the next age to decide whether it will remember enough, long enough, to recognize the pattern before the silence deepens once more. That unspoken understanding settles into the foundation of the new world, like sediment after a flood. It is not articulated as doctrine. It is lived. Humanity moves forward with an instinctive caution it cannot fully explain. The land is worked, but not exhausted at first. Authority is accepted, but watched. Memory of loss lingers just beneath ambition, tempering it without erasing it. The ancient texts imply that this is the longest phase of the cycle. The rebuilding is slow, uneven, and deeply human. There are no Anunnaki walking openly among people now. No direct instruction. What guides humanity instead is consequence made visible. Cause and effect are close again. When balance slips, correction is immediate. This proximity restores a kind of wisdom that does not need explanation. Over generations, however, distance grows once more. Children are born who never knew the collapse. For them, the world has always been stable enough. The caution inherited from survival begins to feel excessive. Boundaries that once protected begin to feel restrictive. Innovation accelerates. Confidence returns quietly at first. This is the moment when memory begins its slow retreat. not erased, but buried beneath success. Stories of collapse are still told, but they lose urgency. They become lessons for children, not warnings for leaders. Rituals remain, but their original purpose blurs. Alignment is practiced, but no longer understood. The cycle does not respond immediately. It allows this growth. It allows confidence to rebuild. The system is patient. It absorbs error. It stretches. It tolerates imbalance longer than before, because humanity has been slowed, reduced, reset. But tolerance is not infinite. The ancient writers never framed this patience as mercy. They framed it as design. Systems endure deviation up to a point. After that, they correct. The only variable is scale. The larger the system grows, the more force is required to restore balance. And so, without announcement, humanity begins another ascent. Cities will rise again. Knowledge will deepen. Memory will fragment. The sky will continue its cycles, indifferent to human forgetting. Somewhere along that ascent, the same conditions will quietly assemble themselves once more. This is where the ancient narrative leaves catastrophe behind and turns toward interpretation. Not to predict the next reset, but to ask how each age chooses to understand the one before it. Whether it treats collapse as failure or as signal. Whether it listens to the echoes preserved in clay, stone, and story, or dismisses them as relics of a world it believes it has surpassed. The cycle does not care how it is interpreted. It only continues. And humanity, standing once again at the beginning of an ascent, carries forward a question older than any civilization. Not whether the pause will end, but whether recognition will come before it does. That question marks the transition from memory into interpretation. At this stage of the cycle, humanity no longer experiences collapse directly. It studies it, compares fragments, builds theories from ruins and texts whose original contexts are long gone. The Anunnaki return here not as presences, but as problems to be solved, as symbols that refuse to settle into a single explanation. This is where the divide between literal and symbolic readings begins to matter less than the impulse behind them. Whether one believes the Anunnaki were beings of flesh and technology or embodiments of cosmic order, the function they served remains consistent. They appear at moments of imbalance. They withdraw when stability returns. They leave behind systems rather than rule indefinitely. Modern interpretation struggles because it seeks closure. It wants the Anunnaki to be either myth or history, gods or aliens, fiction or fact. The ancient texts resist this binary. They operate in a space where experience, memory, and explanation overlap. The scribes were not concerned with categorization. They were concerned with preservation. From this perspective, the question of literal return becomes secondary. What matters is recurrence. The same structural pressures, the same thresholds, the same corrections expressed through different forms depending on era, environment, and scale. The Anunnaki become a lens through which repetition is recognized rather than a mystery to be solved once and dismissed. This is why cycles dominate the later interpretations, not as superstition, but as pattern. Civilizations rise rapidly after reset. They stabilize, they expand, they saturate, they collapse. The timing varies. The mechanisms differ. The curve remains familiar. The ancients did not claim this was destiny. They claimed it was tendency. In this light, speculation about ancient technology or lost civilizations becomes less sensational and more introspective. The question shifts from what the Anunnaki had to why humanity keeps reaching the same limits regardless of what it has. Tools change. Scale increases. The underlying dynamic persists. The tablets suggest that knowledge alone does not prevent collapse. Awareness of the cycle does not grant immunity. At best, it delays. It softens. It preserves more through the transition. The Anunnaki did not eliminate collapse. They managed it. They intervened to preserve continuity, not permanence. This interpretation is uncomfortable because it removes the hope of final escape. There is no ultimate solution, no technological endpoint, no perfected system immune to imbalance. There is only participation, navigation, memory. And so, as interpretation deepens, the ancient narrative turns its gaze quietly toward the present, not accusing, not warning loudly, simply asking whether humanity, now armed with unprecedented power and complexity, recognizes the familiar shape of its own ascent, and whether it understands that recognition itself does not halt the cycle, but may determine what survives when interpretation gives way once again to experience. That turn toward the present is where the ancient story grows most unsettling, not because it predicts catastrophe, but because it removes the comfort of distance. The cycle is no longer something that happened to others, in forgotten ages, under unfamiliar skies. It is something that unfolds wherever complexity concentrates faster than understanding can follow. The names change, the mechanisms adapt, the shape remains. In the Sumerian framework, the most dangerous illusion is novelty. The belief that because circumstances look different, outcomes must be different as well. The tablets undermine this belief quietly. They acknowledge change, but insist that scale, not novelty, determines consequence. When systems reach a certain density, the same pressures emerge regardless of tools or intentions. This is why the Anunnaki are described as ancient, even in the earliest texts. They are not bound to a single era. They predate cycles rather than belonging to one. Whether interpreted as beings or as representations of higher-order regulation, they stand outside the rise and fall of individual civilizations. Their concern is not progress, but continuity of the system as a whole. The speculation about lost civilizations fits naturally here, not as romantic fantasy, but as logical consequence. If cycles repeat, then previous peaks may have reached levels of sophistication later forgotten. The absence of evidence is not proof of absence when resets are efficient. Water erases, fire erases, time erases. What survives is rarely representative of what once existed. The ancients understood this fragility. That is why they trusted clay over memory, stone over voice. Even then, they knew most would be lost. Preservation was probabilistic, not guaranteed. Enough might survive. That was all they aimed for. This reframes the idea of a warning. The tablets are not alarms meant to prevent collapse. They are anchors meant to stabilize recovery. They assume collapse will happen. Their purpose is to influence what follows, not what precedes. From this perspective, the question of whether we are living in a transition age becomes less dramatic and more structural. Every age is transitional. The difference lies in whether transitions are gentle or abrupt, whether reduction comes through adaptation or through force. The Anunnaki narratives suggest that when adaptation fails, force follows, not because of malice, but because systems correct imbalance through whatever means remain available. Flood, fire, fragmentation. These are not punishments. They are tools. And so the ancient story does not ask the present to fear return. It asks something quieter and more difficult. Whether the systems humanity has built remain flexible enough to adapt. Whether memory remains close enough to guide restraint. Whether complexity still bends or has begun to harden. The answers to those questions are not written in the sky. They are written in behavior, in how quickly imbalance accumulates, in how long correction is delayed, in whether the pause still exists, or whether the cycle has already begun its next movement, unnoticed, as it always has. That unnoticed beginning is how every great transition starts in the ancient framework. Not with spectacle, but with subtle shifts that feel inconsequential at first. Small accelerations, small delays, small compromises that seem reasonable in isolation. The tablets never describe the moment when a cycle truly turns, because from within it, that moment is invisible. Only later does it gain a name. This is why the ancients placed such emphasis on thresholds rather than events. A flood is visible. A collapse is visible. A threshold is not. It is crossed quietly, often without intention. The system absorbs imbalance until it cannot, and the crossing only becomes apparent when the response begins. By then, choice has narrowed. The Anunnaki in this interpretation are never early. They do not intervene at the first sign of strain. They appear only when accumulated imbalance reaches a point where correction cannot be avoided. This delay is not neglect. It is necessity. Intervening too early would arrest growth. Intervening too late would erase continuity. Their role, if it exists, is to act at the last possible moment when something can still be carried forward. This explains the paradox in the texts. The Anunnaki are both patient and decisive. They wait through long ages of human activity, then act with overwhelming effect. To human perception, this feels abrupt, even cruel. From a systemic perspective, it is precise. No more force than required, no less than effective. The scribes seem to understand this distinction. They did not ask why correction was delayed. They assumed delay was part of the design. What concerned them was not timing, but preparedness. Whether memory was intact enough to recognize what was happening when the response arrived. This is where the idea of return becomes most ambiguous. Return does not require descent from the sky. It requires visibility. When correction begins, the forces that govern the system become undeniable. Limits reassert themselves. Dependencies collapse. Excess dissolves. In that sense, the Anunnaki return whenever the system makes their function visible again. The ancient texts do not ask humanity to prevent this visibility. They ask humanity to endure it with awareness, to recognize correction not as betrayal, but as restoration, to understand that the system has not failed. It has done exactly what it was designed to do. And yet, awareness alone does not soften impact. It only preserves meaning. Those who understand the cycle still live through it. They still lose. They still rebuild. The difference lies in what survives with them, whether knowledge is carried deliberately or scattered by chance. As the narrative moves toward its final reflections, the ancient voice grows quieter. There is no final warning to deliver, no last revelation to unveil, only a reminder pressed gently into clay and memory alike, that what matters most is not whether the cycle turns again, but whether humanity recognizes the turn as part of something larger than fear, larger than blame, and older than history itself. That recognition, when it comes, rarely arrives as certainty. It arrives as intuition, a sense that familiar explanations no longer fully account for what is happening. The ancients understood this feeling well. They described it as unease without name, a subtle awareness that the ground beneath established assumptions had begun to shift. Not collapse yet, not disaster, just movement. In this phase, humanity often turns inward, searching for meaning in symbols rather than structures. Philosophies emerge. Moral systems deepen. People ask not how the world works, but why it feels unstable. The cycle encourages this turn. When external systems strain, internal narratives grow louder. Belief fills the gaps left by failing explanations. The tablets do not dismiss this impulse. They recognize it as natural. When comprehension falters, meaning offers comfort. but they also imply a danger, meaning can soothe without correcting. It can reinterpret imbalance as fate or justice rather than signal. In doing so, it delays adaptation, sometimes past the point where gentle correction remains possible. This is why the ancient record remains strangely restrained. It does not offer redemption arcs. It does not promise rescue. It does not frame collapse as moral theater. It stays close to process. Cause accumulates. Effect follows. The cycle moves on. As systems tighten and flexibility erodes, humanity often doubles down on what has worked before. More control, more enforcement, more complexity layered onto complexity. From within the moment, this feels responsible. From outside it, the pattern is familiar. The system grows denser, less adaptable, more vulnerable to cascading failure. The Anunnaki, whether remembered as beings or as principle, are absent during this intensification. There is no guidance to override momentum. Humanity must reach the limits of its own solutions before correction can intervene. This is not abandonment. It is boundary. The ancient writers seemed resigned to this necessity. They did not believe humanity could be instructed away from every mistake. Experience was the teacher that remained when memory failed. Collapse, though costly, restored sensitivity to limits in a way instruction never could. And so, as the present phase deepens, the question subtly shifts again. Not whether collapse will occur, but what kind it will be. Abrupt or gradual. Narrow or widespread. Whether it will erase indiscriminately or leave room for continuity. These outcomes, the texts imply, depend less on belief than on preparation. Preparation, in this sense, does not mean defense. It means discernment, knowing what is essential and what is excess, what must survive and what can be allowed to fall away. The ancients did not prepare to save everything. They prepared to save enough. This is the quiet wisdom carried forward into the final movement of the story. That endurance is not about clinging to the present, but about choosing what can be carried into whatever comes next. And that the cycle, indifferent yet precise, will respond not to hope or fear, but to structure, as it always has. That choice of what endures is never made all at once. It emerges gradually, often unconsciously, through countless small decisions. What knowledge is taught? What stories are repeated? What practices are maintained even when they seem inconvenient? The ancient texts imply that continuity is shaped long before collapse is visible, woven quietly into daily life while the system still appears stable. In earlier cycles, those who preserved knowledge were rarely the powerful. They were scribes, farmers, observers of the sky, keepers of measures. People whose work required attentiveness rather than authority. Their strength lay not in control, but in patience. They understood that power attracts disruption, while quiet structure often survives unnoticed. This is why the tablets place such emphasis on recording rather than ruling. Kings rise and fall quickly in the texts. Their deeds blur together, but records endure, measurements endure. Calendars endure. These are the bones of civilization, not its muscles. When collapse strips away complexity, what remains is what was built to last without supervision. The Anunnaki narratives elevate this idea without explicitly naming it. They show beings who establish frameworks rather than empires, who intervene to preserve structure, then withdraw. Their power is not domination, but timing. They act when intervention still matters, and vanish when presence would only foster dependence. Seen this way, the greatest gift attributed to them is not technology or knowledge, but spacing. They create pauses, gaps in which humanity must operate on its own. These gaps force adaptation. They reveal which systems are self-sustaining and which collapse without oversight. Over time, this process refines what humanity can truly maintain. As the cycle approaches its reflective phase, the story grows increasingly inward. The question of return dissolves into the question of responsibility. If oversight resumes only when necessary, then the quality of the next age depends on what is carried through the silence. The ancients did not expect humanity to become wise enough to escape cycles. They expected humanity to become careful enough to survive them repeatedly. Wisdom, in their view, was not transcendence. It was selection, knowing what to let go. This reframing strips the Anunnaki of spectacle and leaves something quieter behind. A model of stewardship that does not promise safety, only continuity. A reminder that the future is not built by preserving everything, but by preserving what still works when everything else fails. As the narrative edges toward its final reflections, one truth becomes steady and unavoidable. The cycle does not need belief. It does not need worship. It does not even need memory to continue. But humanity does. Memory is the only thread that allows each new ascent to begin slightly wiser than the last, even if that wisdom is never enough to prevent the next descent. That thread of memory is fragile, yet it has endured longer than any empire. It survives not because it is protected, but because it is adaptable. The ancient texts themselves are evidence of this. Fragmented, translated, misunderstood, yet still capable of transmitting something essential across vast spans of time. They do not deliver certainty. They deliver orientation. Orientation, in the Sumerian sense, was never about direction alone. It was about placement within a larger order, knowing where one stands in relation to cycles, limits, and inherited structures. The Anunnaki stories functioned as coordinates, not answers. They told humanity where it was, not where it was going. As interpretation deepens, the literal question of return fades further into the background. Whether beings descend again from the sky becomes less important than whether the system they represent has begun to assert itself anew. Return is no longer an event to await. It is a condition to recognize. This is why the texts never fix a date or alignment that guarantees reappearance. They speak instead of patterns, signs, accumulations. They assume that when correction begins, explanation will follow, not precede. Humanity will understand only after the fact, as it always has. The ancients seemed at peace with this. Their calm tone is not resignation, but acceptance. They did not believe knowledge granted control. They believed it granted context. To know one is within a cycle does not grant escape. It grants meaning. This acceptance carries into their final reflections. The Anunnaki are not framed as judges of humanity, but as custodians of balance. Their presence or absence is not reward or punishment. It is response. They respond to conditions, not character. And so the story resolves not into prediction, but into posture. How does one live knowing that systems are temporary, that collapse is structural, that renewal is possible but never permanent? The ancients answered quietly, with record-keeping, with alignment, with restraint. They built cities knowing they would fall. They wrote laws knowing they would be broken. They copied tablets knowing most would be lost. This was not futility. It was participation, a willingness to contribute to a process larger than any single outcome. As the narrative approaches its final act, this posture becomes its inheritance, a calm readiness rather than fear, a recognition that cycles are not enemies, but conditions of existence, and that what defines humanity is not its ability to stop them, but its ability to remember itself within them, even as the world shifts once more beneath its feet. That calm readiness is the final skill the ancient texts seem to value above all others. Not prediction, not control, but the ability to remain oriented while the world changes shape. In this sense, the Anunnaki are less a subject of belief than a reference point for posture. They represent a way of standing within uncertainty, without denial or panic. The ancients did not imagine the future as a place of resolution. They imagined it as continuation. Each age inherits unfinished work from the one before it. Each generation receives a world already shaped by choices it did not make. The Anunnaki narratives remind humanity that this inheritance has always included limits, cycles, and correction. As the story reaches its final movement, the focus narrows to something intimate. The individual listener, the quiet moment of recognition when ancient patterns feel uncomfortably familiar, when the distance between then and now collapses into a shared condition. Not fear, but awareness. The texts never urge action in the dramatic sense. They do not call for revolt or retreat. They suggest attentiveness, to signals rather than slogans, to balance rather than growth, to memory rather than certainty. These are not strategies for winning a future. They are practices for surviving transitions. The Anunnaki, if they return at all, return through consequence. Through the reassertion of limits, humanity has stretched too far. Their presence would not announce itself as revelation. It would be felt as adjustment, as reduction, as simplification imposed by circumstance rather than decree. This is why the ancients did not frame return as hope or threat. They framed it as inevitability conditioned by behavior. The system does not judge intentions. It responds to structure. When structure fails, correction arrives. In this understanding, the future is not something to fear, but something to prepare for quietly. Preparation does not mean stockpiling or escape. It means clarity, knowing what matters when complexity falls away, knowing what can still function when excess is stripped. As the narrative settles toward closure, one final insight emerges from the clay and silence. Humanity has never lacked warnings. It has lacked patience with them. The cycle does not hurry. It waits. And in that waiting, it offers each age the same choice. Not to stop what is coming, but to decide what will be carried forward when it does. That decision, what to carry forward, is the quiet responsibility each age inherits without ceremony. The ancient texts never frame it as a grand moral choice. It is practical, almost mundane. What knowledge is simple enough to survive disruption? What practices remain useful when scale collapses? What stories still guide behavior when institutions vanish? In this final stretch of interpretation, the Anunnaki fade almost completely as characters. They remain instead as absence shaped like memory, a reminder that guidance once existed, that systems were once explained rather than inferred. Their withdrawal becomes symbolic of every moment when humanity must act without certainty, relying only on fragments of understanding passed down imperfectly. The ancients seemed to accept that misunderstanding was inevitable. What mattered was not perfect comprehension, but continuity of orientation. Even distorted memory could still point roughly in the right direction. A myth could preserve structure long after facts were lost. A ritual could maintain alignment even when its origin was forgotten. This is why the texts do not attempt to resolve their own contradictions. They leave space for reinterpretation. Space for future readers to project their own circumstances onto ancient frameworks. The warning was never meant to be fixed. It was meant to remain usable. As the story prepares to release its hold, the idea of return dissolves into something quieter still. Return is not an event. It is recognition. The moment when humanity realizes it is once again living inside conditions described long ago. When ancient words feel less like history and more like mirror. In that moment, the Anunnaki are no longer distant beings or speculative visitors. They become a measure, a way of asking whether balance has been maintained or abandoned, whether systems still bend or have begun to fracture, whether memory is still alive enough to matter. The ancients left no final instruction because they knew none would endure unchanged. Instead, they left traces, patterns, cycles, enough for recognition, not enough for certainty. They trusted that future generations, facing their own thresholds, would find meaning not in answers, but in resonance. And so interpretation ends where experience begins. The cycle continues without explanation. The sky keeps turning. Humanity keeps building, forgetting, remembering again. The only constant is the opportunity, repeated endlessly, to meet transition with awareness rather than surprise, and to carry forward, through whatever comes next, the fragile thread of memory that keeps the story from ending completely. That fragile thread is all that remains when certainty dissolves. In the final movement of the ancient story, the tone softens even further, not toward conclusion, but toward release. The texts seem to understand that cycles cannot be closed with answers. They can only be acknowledged, then allowed to continue. What matters now is not interpretation, but inheritance. Inheritance in this sense is not wealth or power. It is orientation, a quiet internal alignment with the understanding that the world has never been static and never will be. That stability is temporary by design. That collapse is not an aberration, but a phase. And that renewal does not erase what came before. It rearranges it. The ancients framed this understanding not as burden, but as responsibility. To live knowing that one's actions ripple forward into a future one will never see. To preserve knowledge, not because it guarantees survival, but because it increases the chances that something meaningful will persist. To accept that no generation completes the work it begins. In this light, the Anunnaki become almost irrelevant as figures. Their true legacy is not their presence, but the posture they modeled. Intervention without attachment, withdrawal without abandonment, action guided by balance rather than emotion. Whether they were beings, symbols, or memory of a higher order process, their function was always the same: to maintain continuity through disruption. The ancient writers never imagined an end to the cycle. They imagined handoffs, one age passing fragments to the next, sometimes deliberately, sometimes by accident, sometimes through catastrophe, sometimes through quiet decay. The story does not climax. It exhales. As the narrative slows, the focus narrows again to the listener, not as observer, but as participant. Every listener lives inside a cycle they did not begin and will not finish. Every life occupies a brief window of apparent normalcy between changes too large to fully grasp. The choice is not whether to escape this condition, but how to inhabit it. The ancients suggest a simple answer: with attentiveness, with restraint, with memory, not clinging to permanence but honoring continuity, not fearing collapse but recognizing its role, not worshiping the past but listening to it. And so the story does not end with warning or prophecy. It settles instead into a quiet recognition that humanity has always lived this way, building within cycles, forgetting within comfort, remembering within loss, carrying forward, imperfectly but persistently, the awareness that something older than fear and older than hope continues to move beneath the surface of history, turning slowly, patiently, waiting for nothing, ending nothing, and beginning again. That slow turning beneath history is never meant to be confronted directly. The ancients understood that to stare too long at the machinery of cycles is to lose the ability to live within them. Awareness must remain gentle, like peripheral vision, enough to orient, not enough to paralyze. This is why their wisdom was woven into stories rather than formulas. Stories breathe, they adapt, they survive where rigid instruction shatters. In the closing reflections of the tablets, there is a sense of quiet trust. Not optimism, not despair. Trust in process. Trust that even when memory thins to near invisibility, something essential persists. A rhythm, a proportion, a tendency toward balance that reasserts itself regardless of belief. The Anunnaki, at this stage, are barely named. Their absence speaks louder than their presence ever did. They become shorthand for something humanity once understood intuitively and now must relearn through experience. Not supervision, but consequence. Not command, but response. The ancients seem to accept that every generation believes itself to be different, more advanced, more aware, less bound by ancient limits. And every generation eventually discovers the same constraints waiting beneath new language and new tools. This discovery is not failure. It is confirmation. What survives these confirmations is rarely impressive. It is not monuments or empires. It is habits. Ways of measuring time, ways of organizing community, ways of telling stories that remind listeners quietly that nothing they see is final. These small survivals matter more than grand achievements because they can pass unnoticed through disruption. As the narrative nears its end, it releases urgency entirely. There is no call to prepare, no insistence that recognition must happen now. The cycle does not require urgency. It will proceed at its own pace. Human anxiety does not accelerate it, and human denial does not stop it. The only invitation left is subtle, to notice patterns without obsessing over them, to hold memory lightly without clinging, to build with care even while knowing impermanence is certain. This balance, the ancients believed, was the closest humanity could come to wisdom. And so the story does not close with an answer. It rests instead in a pause like the one humanity always inhabits between corrections. Calm, unassuming, easily mistaken for permanence, yet alive with motion just beneath the surface, waiting patiently for the next gentle turn of the wheel. In that pause, life continues exactly as it always has. People wake, work, love, argue, build, forget. The scale of the cycle is too vast to interrupt daily existence. This, too, was understood by the ancients. The purpose of memory was never to dominate thought, but to provide depth to it, a background awareness that softens certainty and tempers excess. The final tablets do not look forward or backward. They look inward. They treat humanity not as a problem to be solved, but as a participant in a process that does not require permission. The Anunnaki, in this inward gaze, dissolve completely into function. They are no longer entities, but reminders that no system is self-originating and no order is self-sustaining forever. The ancients believed that when humanity forgot this, correction followed. When it remembered, balance endured a little longer. Not forever, just long enough. Enough time for another generation to live, learn, and pass something on. This view strips history of its drama and replaces it with continuity. There are no final battles, no ultimate revelations, only recurring phases experienced under different names, golden ages, dark ages, recoveries, each one feeling unique from the inside, each one familiar from afar. As modern minds search the past for answers, the ancient texts offer something quieter. They suggest that the most important knowledge is not predictive. It is contextual. Knowing where one stands in relation to cycles does not grant control. It grants composure. Composure was the ancients' final gift, a way to face uncertainty without despair, a way to acknowledge collapse without surrender, a way to rebuild without illusion. This composure is not indifference. It is humility practiced over generations. And perhaps this is why the tablets were buried rather than displayed. They were not meant to shout across time. They were meant to wait, to be found when humanity once again reached a point where certainty felt thin and questions felt heavy, to offer not instruction, but companionship across ages. The story, then, concludes not with warning, but with presence. The sense that others have stood here before, that they noticed the same patterns, that they left behind not solutions, but traces of understanding. Enough to remind future listeners that they are not alone inside the pause, and never have been. And so the cycle releases us gently, the way it always does, without announcement, without resolution. The ancient voice fades not because it has finished speaking, but because it has said what it can. What remains is silence shaped by meaning, and a world continuing exactly as it must. The Anunnaki do not return in this ending, not as figures in the sky or rulers of the earth. Their role is complete the moment recognition settles. When humanity understands that return has never been about arrival, but about alignment, about the reappearance of limits, consequences, and balance whenever excess drifts too far. This understanding is not meant to keep anyone awake at night. It is meant to allow rest, to let the mind loosen its grip on certainty, to accept that nothing needs to be forced, predicted, or prevented absolutely. The cycle does not require fear to function. The ancients trusted this deeply. They built, knowing collapse would come. They recorded, knowing loss would follow. They taught, knowing forgetting was inevitable. And still, they acted, not because success was guaranteed, but because participation mattered. That is the quiet inheritance left behind. Not prophecy, not warning, but belonging. Humanity belongs to this long rhythm of ascent and release, memory and forgetting, order and correction. To resist it is futile. To understand it is sufficient. As the story finally dissolves, it leaves no command behind, only an invitation to sleep with awareness rather than anxiety, to recognize the present moment as one gentle phase among many, neither beginning nor end, just another place where the wheel pauses briefly, letting life happen. Somewhere beneath the surface of time, the cycle continues its slow turning. It does not hurry, it does not judge, it waits for nothing. And in that patience, it holds every civilization, every story, every listener, carrying them forward and letting them go again and again without conclusion.